They say every American town has one house that doesn't quite fit. The kind of place people pass by without looking directly at it because something inside feels wrong. In the small town of Ashbury Hollow, that house sat at the end of a gravel road that locals stopped driving down decades ago. Windows boarded shut, roof half collapsed. Yet a single light still glowed behind the curtains. No one could say who lived there now, but everyone remembered who used to. The Krowe family, a name once spoken with pride, now barely whispered at all. They'd come to Ashbury in the 1800s, buying up farmland and building what they called a legacy. But behind their wealth, their carefully posed family portraits, their polished Sunday smiles, there were secrets too deep for daylight. People said they kept to themselves. People said they had their reasons. People didn't ask questions. Until one night, a child ran out of that house barefoot and screaming. The sheriff who found her said she wouldn't speak for days. When she finally did, her words didn't make sense. Or maybe they made too much sense for anyone to believe. She said, "They said the blood was wrong." She said, "They said we had to stay clean." And when the sheriff tried to ask who they were, she only pointed back toward the house, toward the dark windows, toward everything her family had built. The next morning, the Krowe property was abandoned. The family was gone, vanished as if the earth had swallowed them. And for decades, no one dared to look for them, until a historian, someone like me, stumbled upon the letters, faded paper sealed with wax, hidden in the attic of a farmhouse 3 towns over. The letters were dated from the early 1900s, the handwriting familiar, the name signed at the bottom unmistakable. It was a Krowe. That's when I realized the truth. The Krowes didn't vanish. They buried themselves, in paper and blood, and in silence. What I found inside those letters would change everything I thought I knew about family, legacy, and what people are willing to do to keep their secrets from dying. The first letter was dated November 12, 1903. It began with a single line that chilled me to my bones. They told us to marry within, so the blood would never forget where it came from. The handwriting was shaky, the ink smudged as if written in panic. The author was a woman named Krowe, the matriarch of the family, known in local records for her charity work and Sunday sermons. But what the records didn't say, what this letter whispered between every uneven stroke, was that Eleanor wasn't writing to a friend or a lover. She was writing to herself. She described rituals at the house, quiet ones, performed at night when the town was asleep. The family gathered in the parlor beneath portraits of their ancestors, each painting watching with glassy, judgmental eyes. A small silver cup passed from hand to hand. Each sip was taken to preserve the line. She wrote of children being born pale and fragile, some never making it past a few months. Yet the family carried on the same tradition, generation after generation. Eleanor's words painted a portrait of a family so obsessed with purity that they forgot what humanity was. Her husband, Thomas, enforced the rules. No strangers, no outsiders. He claimed it was God's will. But the way Eleanor wrote, you could tell. Even she didn't believe it anymore. She was terrified of her own home. And then she wrote something that stopped me cold. If they find out what I've done, they'll bury me beneath the others. That line, beneath the others, appeared 3 more times in later pages, almost like a mantra or a warning. Local historians had always known about the Krowe cemetery, a private plot fenced off behind the house, where generations were buried side by side. But if Eleanor was telling the truth, there might have been more graves, ones the records never listed. When I visited what was left of the Krowe property, I saw the cemetery still standing. The tombstones were cracked, the names half erased. But there were fresh indentations in the ground, subtle, unnatural, like the earth had been disturbed recently. And that's when I realized maybe the Krowes weren't done keeping secrets after all. The second letter came weeks later, December 3rd, 1903. It was shorter, more frantic, the ink pressed so deep into the paper it almost tore. Eleanor's words were different this time. There was no calm reflection, no rational voice, only fear. She wrote, "Thomas knows. He found the lock of hair I hid. At first, I didn't understand. A lock of hair. Then I found the next line. It wasn't from our kind." That phrase, "or kind." It kept appearing again and again in the Krowe letters. I started to piece it together. The Krowes didn't just guard their bloodline out of vanity or pride. They believed their lineage carried something sacred or cursed, and any attempt to dilute it was an act of betrayal. Eleanor's tone shifted from terror to guilt. She confessed to meeting someone, a farmhand from outside Ashbury, a man named Caleb. He had come to help with repairs after a storm. The two had fallen in love quietly, carefully, the way people do when they know it could destroy them. She called him the first breath of clean air I'd had in years. But when her husband discovered the affair, something changed in that house. Thomas wrote nothing himself, no records, no journals. But his actions were all over the property. In the cellar, there were hooks driven into the walls, chains rusted into the floor, and above them, carved into the wood, the initials CM, Caleb's initials. Eleanor's last words in that letter read, "I hear him beneath us. Every night I hear him still." That line haunted me for weeks. I tried to convince myself it was metaphorical. Grief, guilt, the madness of isolation. But the deeper I went, the harder it became to tell what was imagination and what was evidence. Local rumors said that during the winter of 1904, the Krowes closed their doors entirely. No one saw them at church. No one heard from them at the market. Smoke stopped rising from the chimney. But late one night, a farmhand on a neighboring property reported hearing screams carried across the snow. He said it sounded like a woman crying for help, and a man praying in another voice, louder, faster, until the sound stopped. He never reported it, because in Ashbury, the Krowes weren't questioned. They were feared. The third letter wasn't found in the attic like the others. It was hidden inside a Bible, wedged deep between the pages of Leviticus, as if Eleanor wanted God to be the one to read it. The date was gone, ink smeared by water damage, but what remained was unsettling. It began with only one sentence. I dug where he told me not to. The rest was fragmented, the handwriting shaking apart into madness. She spoke of a noise. A pulse in the floorboards, she called it. Something that made the lamps tremble when she tried to sleep. She wrote that Thomas no longer spoke to her in words, only in prayers, and that their children had started whispering things she didn't understand, phrases in a language she swore she'd never taught them. She mentioned one child by name, Abigail, 10 years old. Eleanor said Abigail had begun waking up with dirt under her nails, though her room was spotless, her window nailed shut. When Eleanor asked what she'd been doing, Abigail simply smiled and said, I was talking to Caleb. That's when I realized Eleanor didn't just bury guilt. She buried a body. And from the sound of it, the family didn't let it rest. Eleanor wrote about Thomas leading the children into the cellar, forcing them to kneel, forcing them to listen to the earth. She described hearing voices from below, whispers rising through the cracks of the floorboards, begging, warning, praying. At first, she thought it was her mind breaking, but then she saw Thomas start answering back. The last line was barely legible, scratched into the paper, not written. He said we must feed the roots, or they'll come for us all. Roots. That word appeared in later family records, scrawled into the margins of birth certificates, wills, even sermons from the local church. The Krowes had replaced their God with something older, something they believed was living beneath them. When I looked at the land deeds from that era, a pattern emerged. The Krowe property sat directly atop one of the oldest burial grounds in the county, dating back to before Ashbury Hollow even had a name. Indigenous graves, forgotten, paved over, claimed by settlers who thought their blood was the only kind that mattered. Maybe the Krowes weren't just protecting their bloodline. Maybe they were trying to keep something buried. By the time I reached the fourth letter, the paper itself felt wrong, brittle, almost waxy, like skin. The date, February 1904. The tone, desperate. This wasn't the voice of a woman holding on to faith anymore. It was the voice of someone trying to survive her own home. Eleanor wrote that Thomas had begun sealing rooms shut. The nursery first, then the attic, then her own parlor. He called it purification. She called it imprisonment. Every night, she said, he would light a single candle, set it in the hallway, and whisper to the shadows until it burned out. Sometimes, when she pressed her ear to the door, she swore she could hear other voices whispering back. Familiar ones. But the most disturbing part wasn't what she heard. It was what she saw. Eleanor said Thomas had begun keeping records. Strange diagrams drawn in chalk on the cellar floor. Circles intersected by dozens of lines, each marked with the names of their ancestors. She described a center circle labeled the origin. That word, origin, would later appear on a tombstone no one in town had ever noticed before, half buried behind the Krowe family plot. No first name, no dates. Just that single word. She said the children had become pale and quiet. They moved together now, spoke together, even ate together in silence. And when she tried to take them away, tried to run, Thomas stopped her at the edge of the woods. He told her something she couldn't forget. There's nowhere else to go. The blood remembers where it belongs. That line struck me because it wasn't just madness. It was doctrine. Generations of isolation had twisted into religion. They weren't keeping secrets anymore. They were worshipping them. Eleanor's letter ended with an unfinished thought. If anyone finds this, don't look for the others. There, the ink blood out there, smeared by what looked like tears. But on the back of the paper, faintly, another hand had written something in pencil. Firmer, colder, we found her. She understands now. That wasn't Eleanor's handwriting. It was Thomas's. When I read that, I realized this wasn't just a woman's descent into madness. It was documentation, a record of control, ritual, and fear passed down like inheritance. And somehow, those rituals didn't die with them. Because in 1972, nearly 70 years later, construction workers unearthed the Krowe cellar during a road expansion project. And what they found down there made even the sheriff's deputies refuse to enter. They said it smelled like wet iron and rot the moment they broke through the concrete. Beneath the Krowe house, the workers uncovered a hidden chamber, smaller than a cellar, more like a vault. The walls were stone, carved by hand, and the air inside was heavy, almost alive. One of the men described it as breathing. Inside that chamber were 7 coffins. 6 were arranged in a perfect circle. The 7th sat in the center. Each was unmarked. No names, no dates. Just the faint outline of the same symbol Eleanor had once described. The intersecting circles, the word origin scratched into the lid. When authorities opened the first coffin, they expected bones. Instead, they found something far stranger. Fragments of hair, fabric, and soil. Layers of earth carefully packed around a small porcelain doll. It wasn't a burial. It was a ritual. But the central coffin, that one was different. Larger, newer, sealed with nails so corroded they looked black. When they pried it open, the men stepped back immediately. Because it wasn't empty. Inside lay what appeared to be the preserved remains of a woman. Not decomposed, preserved. Her skin waxy, her eyes open, staring. Her hands clutched something tight against her chest. A bundle of letters, bound with a red ribbon. The sheriff ordered the site sealed. The state took over within a day. No reports were filed. No autopsy ever made it into the record. But one of the workers, years later, told his son what he'd seen. And that story eventually found its way to me. He said the woman's lips were parted, as if she'd been trying to speak. And carved into the underside of the coffin lid, hidden from view unless someone pried it open, were words scratched by fingernail, "Do not wake the roots." That phrase sent me down another path entirely, through old court records, land deeds, even medical logs. And I found something chilling. Every generation of the Krowe family had at least one child who died mysteriously or simply disappeared. The official causes ranged from fever to accidents, but the timing was always the same: late winter when the ground froze deep. Locals began saying the family had made a pact. Others whispered they were cursed. But the truth, I think, was something much darker. They believed death was payment. Payment to something older than their name, something they had dug up and couldn't put back. And the worst part, the records show one surviving heir, a great-granddaughter last seen in 1981, living quietly under another name, not far from where the Krowe house once stood. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? I found her name in a hospital record from 1981, Margaret Ann Cole, but the handwriting in the admission file was wrong, too neat for a nurse's note. And the address listed. It was the same location as the old Krowe farm, the one the county records claimed had been demolished decades earlier. When I tracked down what stood there now, it wasn't a house. It was an assisted living facility. Quiet, private, hidden behind a grove of dying oak trees. The staff said they'd never heard of a Margaret Cole. But when I described her, one of the nurses hesitated. Then she said, "There's a woman here who never gives her last name. Came in years ago. Never leaves her room." She took me down a narrow hallway that smelled faintly of antiseptic and old wood. Room 9. The door was half open. Inside, an elderly woman sat in a chair facing the window, her hair long and silver, her skin pale as parchment. When I said her name, she didn't answer. But when I said, "Krowe," she flinched. Slowly, she turned to face me. Her eyes were sharp, unfocused, the eyes of someone who's seen too much and learned not to speak of it. On her nightstand was an old photograph, a family gathered in front of the Krowe house, dressed in black. I recognized Eleanor, Thomas, the children. But at the edge of the frame stood a figure the others didn't seem to see. A tall shape, blurred, half in shadow, its hand resting on Thomas's shoulder. I asked the woman where she'd found the photo. She said it had always been there. Then, almost whispering, she said, "You think it's over because the house is gone, but it's not the house that remembers. It's the blood." Her voice was so quiet I had to lean closer to hear her. She went on, "They made promises under the floor. They planted him, and he grew. Every year they tried to feed the roots, but when they stopped, he started taking his own." Before I could ask what she meant, she turned her gaze toward the window, the trees outside bending slightly though there was no wind. She said, "You can hear it when it's hungry." And then she smiled, just barely, a tired, knowing smile. "You shouldn't have come here." When I looked back down at the nightstand, the photograph was gone. In its place, an old, folded letter sealed with red wax. The initials were unmistakable EK. I opened the letter that night in my car, under the flickering streetlight outside the facility. The paper was fragile, yellowed, and smelled faintly of soil. Inside were only a few lines, written in that same uneven script I'd come to recognize as Eleanor's. "The roots remember the voice that feeds them. They do not forgive silence. If you find this, it means the hunger has moved beyond the house." I read it again and again, hoping it would make sense, that it was just the rambling of a dying mind. But when I turned the paper over, I found something else, a map, hand-drawn, crude, but unmistakable. It showed the layout of the Krowe property as it had been in the early 1900s. The cellar, the orchard, the family cemetery, and then, beyond the marked graves, a single word scrawled in the dirt, colored int, below. The next day, I went back to the site. The old road leading there was nothing more than a narrow path now, half swallowed by weeds. The air was heavy, too still. When I reached where the house had once stood, all that remained were its foundations, cracked stone outlines overgrown with roots thick as wrists. I stood in what would have been the parlor, the place Eleanor said the family gathered for their rituals. The ground beneath my feet felt soft wrong, like it was breathing. I followed the map to the cemetery. Most of the graves were unreadable, weathered down by a century of rain and neglect. But the earth looked disturbed again. Shallow mounds where it should have been level. And in the center, just like the drawing, was a patch of bare ground with no marker at all. When I stepped closer, I heard it. A sound I can't fully describe. Not a voice, not an animal, but a vibration. Low, steady, pulsing through the soil. It was faint at first, like the echo of something far below. But the longer I listened, the clearer it became. A rhythm, a heartbeat. And then, faintly, from the trees behind me, a whisper. My name. I froze. The woods were empty, no wind, no movement. But the whisper came again, softer, closer this time, as if rising from the ground itself. I don't remember running back to the car. I don't remember starting the engine. But I remember the last thing I saw in the rearview mirror. The trees behind me bending, not from wind, but from something moving underneath them. That night, I couldn't sleep, because when I closed my eyes, I kept hearing that pulse, slow, patient, waiting. For weeks, I told myself it was imagination, the mind filling silence with superstition. But the more I tried to move on, the more the crows followed me. The pulse wasn't only in my dreams now. I started hearing it in the walls of my home, faint and irregular, like something alive behind the plaster. I changed outlets. I shut off the water. It didn't stop. I began digging deeper into local archives, chasing facts that could explain what was happening. That's when I found the Ashbury Parish record, 1836, predating the Krowes' arrival. It mentioned a clearing ritual, performed by settlers to purify the land of the dead who would not rest. They had disturbed an indigenous burial ground and believed the spirits beneath the soil cursed the living. Their solution was brutal: burn the graves, salt the earth, and build a home over the ashes. That home became the Krowe estate. Eleanor hadn't created the darkness. She had inherited it. The curse, the rituals, the obsession with keeping the bloodline pure. It was never about pride. It was about containment. The Krowes weren't guarding their blood from the world. They were binding something inside it. There's a line in one of the later letters, one that used to make no sense to me. It said, "When the blood runs thin, the earth will thirst again." I thought it was poetry madness. But if every generation lost a child in late winter, if every death was a form of payment, then maybe that wasn't metaphor. Maybe it was a warning. When I returned to the Krowe land a second time, I brought recording equipment. I set the microphone on the ground, directly over that unmarked patch in the cemetery. For 20 minutes, there was nothing, and then faintly a sound, not wind, not static, a slow, deliberate thud, then another, and another. It was rhythmic, almost human. When I played the recording back later that night, I turned the volume all the way up. After the third pulse, you can hear something else underneath. A voice, muffled and strained. 3 words, barely audible but unmistakable. "Let me grow." That was the last time I stepped foot in Ashbury Hollow. But even now, sitting hundreds of miles away, sometimes I swear I can still feel the floor move beneath me. A soft tremor, slow, steady, familiar. And when it happens, I don't breathe. Because deep down, I know it isn't the ground that's moving. It's the roots. A few days later, a package arrived at my door. No return address. No postage stamp. Just my name, written in that same narrow, deliberate handwriting I'd seen on the Krowe letters. Inside was an old reel of film, sealed in a tin canister streaked with rust. No note. No explanation. I shouldn't have watched it. Every instinct told me not to. But curiosity, that terrible human weakness, always wins in stories like these. The reel began with silence. Grainy black and white footage, filmed sometime in the 1950s, judging by the clothing. The image flickered, shaking slightly. A family stood in front of a farmhouse. Children laughing, a woman smiling, older, but unmistakable. Eleanor Krowe's eyes, alive again in another generation. Then the camera shifted. Someone was filming the ground. No faces, just earth. The lens lingered on the base of an old oak tree. Its roots jutted from the soil like ribs. The film jumped suddenly. Spliced frames, maybe cut to hide something. But one image lingered too long to ignore a pair of bare feet, half buried, unmoving. After that, the footage became chaotic. Quick flashes of faces in the dark. Someone whispering prayers backwards. A man holding a candle, eyes wide, mouthing words that didn't sound like any language I knew. Then, the screen went white. At the end of the reel, there was only one frame of text, burned into the film. Never died. He just learned to wait. I replayed it again and again, trying to find meaning, trying to prove it was fake. But every time I did, something strange happened. The same low pulse returned through my speakers, faint and slow, syncing perfectly with my heartbeat. Later that night, I noticed dirt under my fingernails. I hadn't been outside. My shoes were clean, my floor spotless. Still, there it was. Black soil, the same color I'd seen caked around the graves in Ashbury Hollow. And when I looked in the mirror, for a moment, just a moment, I saw someone standing behind me. Not a reflection, not a shadow. A tall, blurred shape, its hand resting on my shoulder. I turned. Nothing. But the air was heavy, thick with the scent of earth. It took hours for the shaking in my hands to stop. When I finally sat down, I opened my notebook and wrote one final entry. The Krowes didn't hide their secret from the world. They planted it, and maybe it's still growing.